Representative Murphy moves Floor Amendment 0205H. It's printed in House Record 14 on pages 826 and 827 and is recognized to speak to this motion.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker and honored colleagues, when I put my daughter to bed at night, she sometimes asks me to check the room for monsters. And I reassure her that there are no monsters, but when I do this, it is never far from my mind that I am lying to her for her own peace of mind. Because there really are monsters. Monsters that derive pleasure from committing the most evil, heinous acts that one can imagine. Acts that are difficult to speak of or consider in this hall. Some of these monsters are very well known to the public. Ted Bundy killed over 30 girls and women, raping them before and after death. Jeffrey Dahmer raped, murdered, and 8 to 17 young boys. Gary Ridgway confessed to killing 71 women. Joseph Rader, the BTK, fined, tortured, killed 10 people. And of course, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, killed 33 young men and boys and buried their bodies in his basement. But here's the truth most do not know, or at least try not to think about. Those infamous names are the tip of a very dark iceberg. 20 years ago, I was a bank teller in South Baltimore. One of my regular customers was a man named Joe Matheny. He was the night watchman at a pallet factory down the street, and he came in to cash his paycheck every Friday. One day, he stopped coming in. I remember asking my colleagues, what happened to Joe? Has anyone seen Joe? No one knew. A week or two later, I read the newspaper and I found out why he had been in. He was arrested and charged for kidnapping young women, taking them back to his trailer at the factory, where he would rape them, torture them, strangle them. He would pull the meat from their bones and mix it with pork and serve it to the public at a roadside stand. That's the most gruesome thing I'm going to say today, I promise. There are other names from Maryland I can tell you. John Thanos, who killed 3 teenagers. He told his victims' parents in court that he wished their dead children could rise again so he could kill them all over again. Juan Perez killed 3 children in the apartment around the corner from my residence, and so on and so on. My point is this: no one in this room had probably heard those names before I said them. Just as no one in Maryland has heard the names of Sheila LeBaire, Christopher Gribble, James Parker, or Michael Addison. Every state has a list of these murderers, these monsters. Every state has a piece of this huge, dark iceberg. And the ones who know it are the police officers that see the bodies, and the prosecutors that see the photographs. And that's why the law enforcement community overwhelmingly opposes repealing the death penalty. Regardless of everything else said here today, the single most important reason that our state needs the death penalty is that justice demands that monsters like these be executed. There is no reason why our society must tolerate people that commit such heinous acts. There is no justice in allowing them to read and eat and read and sleep and see the sun and watch television while their victims are dead and their families grieve and suffer. Let's talk for a moment about Michael Addison. When death row for killing Officer Michael Briggs, if we repeal this death penalty, he will still meet his justice. The governor has said she will sign the bill and still sign his death warrant. But if the death penalty is never justified, why is she willing to have Addison executed? She would snap her fingers if you said he's life in prison, but she has said she wants him to die for his crime. If you vote to repeal the death penalty because you believe executing monsters is wrong, then you should be here demanding that his life be spared. You don't get it both ways. But here's the obvious question: what about the next officer who was killed? I wish I was wrong, but it is only a matter of time. We've already made another law enforcement officer arrest since Officer Briggs, and the only reason that the state did not pursue the death penalty in that case is that the killer committed suicide. If Addison deserves to die for killing a police officer, then doesn't the next murder and the next and the next? Where will the justice be for those families when the inevitable sadly happens? The answer is it won't be there. It will be taken from them by those who were not only willing to let Addison die for his crime, they demanded that no one after him. Two of the sponsors of the repeal bill tragically lost their fathers to murderers. I am very, very sorry that that happened, that they suffered that loss. I have heard each of them say that they do not want the men who killed their fathers to pay with their lives. That is their judgment. It is not my place to question it and respect it. Perhaps they are better men than I. But I believe that if I were to find myself in that position, and someone in my immediate family were murdered, I would want the killer to be me. Anything less would seem an injustice to me. With my loved one in the ground while the killer gets 3 hots and a cot for the rest of his life. I would want to be there when he was executed. I would want to hold a picture of my wife and child. So the last thing that monster saw was the face of the loved one killed. It is hard for me to say without being in that situation, but I believe I would find some justice in that outcome. And I'm not alone, because I was recently told by a member of law enforcement that when the AG visited the family of Officer Briggs after his murder, she asked them what they wanted. And they told her they wanted the death penalty. I hope they aren't the last family to have that respect. I'm sure we will hear the argument made that innocent people may be executed. There have been people exonerated while on death row through the appeals process and the use of DNA evidence. But in the modern era of capital punishment, not a single person has ever been shown to be innocent after being executed. And it's not for lack of trying. Death penalty opponents have traveled the country and filed brief after brief, testing DNA evidence and re-interviewing witnesses to find their holy grail, proof of an innocent man executed. Again and again, the evidence has shown the right person was put to death. I want to address some emails that we've seen. We've all seen emails from one sponsor who would have you believe that Carlos de Luna, executed by the state of Texas, was later shown to be innocent. Here's what you need to know about Carlos de Luna without litigating these cases as well. Eyewitnesses said that they saw him stab Burt at a gas station. They said they saw him running from the scene. When the police followed the tips provided by the witnesses, they found him hiding under a truck with no shirt or shoes in February. His arm was covered in fresh scratches. In one pocket, he found a wallet with $2 in it. The other pocket was a clump of small bills totaling $149. That amount of money happened to match the amount missing from the gas station register. His own lawyers to this day say he was guilty. Do I know for an absolute fact that he was guilty? Certainly not. I wasn't there. But the jury that heard days of testimony and deliberated for hours knew it. And it is folly for anyone in this room to pretend that they know better than that jury, which knew full well that a man's life hung in the balance. If this were a bill to raise the standard of proof in capital sentencing beyond any doubt, I'd be down here speaking for it. I don't want our state to execute an innocent man or woman any more than the bill sponsors. But the truth is that obtaining a death sentence here is so difficult that it rules out the possibility of a mistaken execution. New Hampshire is the most difficult state in the country in which to sentence someone to death. There is a 12-point checklist the jury must go through to ascertain the killer should be executed. This is not Texas or Arkansas. We are not executing prisoners every week. We reserve it for the worst of the worst, as we should. There are plenty of other reasons why our state needs death penalty. Our prosecutors need to be able to have the thread of the needle to obtain confessions and locations of bodies so victims' families have the closure here for it. If we do not have the death penalty, killers sentenced to life in prison would be above all further punishment. If one of them kills another inmate or prison guard, how would he be punished? What would be the justice for that victim's family? How do you punish someone who has already been given the maximum penalty under the law? Repeal proponents sometimes say that the death penalty is an easier punishment than life in prison. That's nonsense. The proof for that lies in the fact that any death row inmate can order his attorneys at any time to stop all appeals. Do you know how many do that? It's almost unheard of. Less than 1%. Repeal advocates claim the death penalty isn't deterrent. Nonsense. It's the only 100% deterrent. Once executed, they're guaranteed to never kill again. People can and do escape from prison, even the highest security prisons. Ted Bundy escaped. He raped 5 women before he was recaptured. He killed 3 of them. The youngest was 12 years old. not having the option to sentence the most evil among us to death puts us all at risk, our families and our friends. The amendment before us retains the death penalty, and it adds the murder of a child 12 and under to the list of crimes eligible for capital punishment. As a father, I find the violent murder of a child absolutely heinous. But those people exist. Those monsters do exist. As difficult as it is for us to comprehend or even discuss, there are people out there that find happiness and satisfaction in doing evil, unspeakable things to others, even wide-eyed innocent children. And for them, we must have the ultimate punishment as an option. Justice demands it. Please vote for it. Thank you.
Will the member yield to a question?
I will.
The member yields to Representative DeSimone and may inquire.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for taking my question. Early in your testimony, you spoke about the horror of these monsters. Have you been able to find any data ever that tells us that these horrific monsters can ever be rehabilitated?
No, ma'am.
Thank you.
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. The Chair recognizes the member from Bedford, Representative Cebrowski, to speak in opposition. To be clear, Representative Cebrowski is speaking in opposition to the floor amendment, not the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to the amendment, but in very strong support of the committee report. For three reasons. Number one, prison. Life in prison without parole is a much more substantial and appropriate punishment than being put to death. Have you ever seen the movies, The Green Mile, The Shawshank Redemption, or other such prison life epics? Roll those scenes slowly through your mind. Yes, they contain some Hollywood fluff, but the truth is, the mental, psychological, and physical anguish are not pretty. Have you ever toured the prison in Congress? Believe me, a tiny Spartan cell is nothing near Motel 6, or anything remotely close. The cold concrete, stainless steel facilities, the bars, the other miscreants who are your neighbors, the constant surveillance, not pretty. No more strolling on Hampton Beach. No more Starbucks. No more Red Sox games. Freedom. Freedom. One of the greatest of human gifts is denied. Denied. A life. Life in state prison in a cage without parole. You're never, never off the hook. Death is an escape. Prison is not. Number two, lack of deterrence. Desperate people do terrible, desperate things. Desperate people are not deterred. Desperate people do not think of consequences. The death penalty is not a deterrent to capital crime. Thankfully, the days of gruesome public punishments, such as dismemberment, impaling on a stake, crucifixions, and beheadings are gone. And while those may have been somewhat effective deterrents in their day, because the public was often forced to observe, I don't believe for a second that a perpetrator today stops to think and is deterred by the potential of today's very private and clinical death penalty. alternate public flogging. Each abolition represents an advance of civilization. Abolition of the death penalty represents a further advance. I want to read that last sentence one more time. Each abolition represents an advance of civilization. Abolition of the death penalty represents a further advance. Make no mistake, I am a huge fan of accountability, of punishment for heinous capital crimes, for cases of extreme gravity. Life without parole. Life, a time to dwell on the choice, to dwell on a desperate action gone very, very bad. Dwelling on it over and over and over again. In a cage. That's accountability, and that's punishment. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And we ask for a roll call vote.
Will the member yield to a question?
Madam Speaker, in the interest of no speaker for the time.
The member does not yield. The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. The Chair recognizes the member from Claremont, Representative Gagnon, to speak against the floor amendment.
As previous speaker, I'm here to speak, and I rise to speak in support of HB 1170, which repeals the death penalty. The process for me to...
Would the member please suspend, but in opposition to
Yes,
Floor Amendment
yes,
0205?
Yes, thank you.
Just to clarify.
The process for coming to this decision was not immediate and it wasn't easy. And perhaps like many of you, there was a time when I supported the death penalty. Although I never thought of the death penalty as a deterrent to crime, my support was more in terms of retribution, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That was where I was coming from. However, thankfully, I've changed my position, and today I realize that the death penalty is not good policy. It's archaic and it's ineffective. There just have been too many incidents where science, specifically DNA testing, has proven convicted individuals innocent and overturned these miscarriages of justice. Just this morning, we heard of a fellow in Louisiana, 30 years in jail, proven innocent, waiting on death row. There are just so many numerous instances that we really need to repeal this bill. And I urge you all to support the legislation. And I believe that regardless of where you fit on the political spectrum, you should support this bill. If you're a progressive, you feel that the death penalty is barbaric and uncivilized, then certainly you should support this bill. If you're a person of faith and adhere to the Ten Commandments, you'll remember the Fifth Commandment and vote for this bill. If you're someone who believes in law and order and holding people accountable for their actions, then you will vote for this bill. Because serving a life sentence, as previously said, without the chance of parole, is a much tougher verdict and a much tougher sentence. Lastly, if you're fiscally prudent, you should support this bill. Because serving a life sentence without parole is less expensive than what we presently experience with long, drawn-out legal maneuvers and costly court appeals. Furthermore, let me say that I'm not an expert on authority, on murder, and every aspect of the death penalty, and certainly the psychological makeup of people who commit murder. I'm sure that many of them are sociopaths and have no remorse for their actions whatsoever. But yesterday, when I was thinking about what I was going to say today, I thought back, and I thought back of the 2 or 3 cases of individuals I've known who actually were convicted of killing somebody. And instances of having known them. And what I do remember is that they always consistently told me that they committed the crime of murder in an emotional state of rage and passion. It was never planned. It was never thought out. They didn't think it out in advance. The death penalty certainly wasn't a deterrent. Actually, in a couple of cases that I do remember specifically, they often said that they found it harder to live with the fact that they had taken someone's life. That was the hardest thing. So they weren't psychopaths. These were individuals who had a heart. And one of them, who wasn't convicted of murder, but was involved with the murder of his of his uncle who raised him. That person served many years in prison, finally got paroled, and has done an amazing turnaround in his life, and has spent probably the last 20 or 30 years working with children.
Would the member please suspend?
Yes.
I would remind the member that the question before us is the floor amendment.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't... Thank you. Let me just say that I urge you to vote down the amendment and vote for the bill. Thank you.
Will the member yield to a question? The member does not yield. The question before the House is floor amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. The chair recognizes the member from Concord, Representative Wallner, to speak in opposition to the floor amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, I rise in opposition to the amendment. The amendment keeps and expands the death penalty. The bill would repeal the death penalty. I am here today to talk to you about the cost of the death penalty. Each of us will make our decision today based on many factors. And I understand that no one will make their decision solely on the cost. But I think it is important that we all understand what the death penalty means to the finances of the state of New Hampshire. Presently, New Hampshire has one death penalty case. Michael Addison, convicted and sentenced to death, would be the first death row inmate to be executed in New Hampshire since 1939. Addison's prosecution, according to the Attorney General's office, has cost the state $2.4 million as of December of 2013. The defense effort to date has cost taxpayers even more, $2.6 million. To date, New Hampshire has spent $5 million on this one case. The future of this one case will be even more expensive. The Supreme Court case is less than one-half finished. The entire appeal could cost New Hampshire several $million more. In New Hampshire, the average non-capital defense costs between $50,000 and $100,000. Prosecution costs are similar, and the cost to house an inmate in New Hampshire is approximately $35,000 a year. Judge days in the Addison case totaled 53 days. That's enough for 5 non-capital cases. Jury selection in this case took 17 days. Most cases take 3.5 days. The Addison trial was 36 days long. The average non-capital murder trial is 6.5 days. The death penalty's complexity, length, and finality drive the final cost through the roof. Capital punishment is far more costly than life without parole at $35,000 per year. New Hampshire's one death penalty case will probably cost the state upwards of $8 to $10 million. The reality is that the death penalty cases postpone justice for victims' families and devour millions of taxpayer dollars that could be used to solve cold cases, prevent crime, restore victims, and protect the public. I ask you to consider the cost of the death penalty as you make your decision. Ask yourself, is this the best use of taxpayer dollars? Several $1 million to execute a person, or less than $1 million to have a sentence of life without parole? I urge you to vote down the amendment and support the committee report.
Will the member yield to a question? The member does not yield. The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. The chair recognizes the member from Goffstown, Representative Warden, to speak in opposition to the floor amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This amendment would extend the death penalty to a specific class of victim not currently included in the death penalty capital punishment statutes. I came to this issue regarding the repealing of the death penalty from the perspective of one who cherishes and promotes small government and personal liberty at every level. The problem with the death penalty, as extended in this amendment, is that it's so finite. If any mistake has been made in the prosecution, it's possible to sentence the wrong man to death. Not only is it possible, it's been shown to happen over 100 times in the United States in recent memory. People in government are not perfect. They make mistakes. They have personal prejudices and character flaws, just like all of us in this chamber. Not a day goes by that there's been something in the news somewhere about a corrupt politician or a corrupt policeman or a prosecutor or judge. And New Hampshire's not immune to these corrupt practices or malfeasance in office. We all know that. Sometimes it's overzealous prosecution. Sometimes mistakes are made with investigations or lab work. And oftentimes, it's just blind ambition getting in the way of sound judgment. At the highest levels of government work, the positions become very political in nature, with power and ambition often overriding ethics and good police work. Is it common? No. But is it reality? Absolutely. It is because of the fallibility of humans that we should remove the ultimate power of the state to decide who lives and who dies. Thank you.
Will the member yield to the question? The member does not yield. The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. The chair recognizes the member from Brookline, Representative Levesque, to speak in opposition to the floor amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honorable colleagues, I rise to speak against the floor amendment on HB 1170 and in support of repealing the death penalty in New Hampshire. Thurgood Marshall said, "The American people say they support the death penalty, but educate the American people, and they will not support the death penalty." I was first introduced to the concept of the death penalty.
Would the member please suspend? Please state your point of order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This hearing bill is about amendment, not about the death penalty. And we're talking about amending the title on it's about murder of a person 12 years of age.
I think if you would note that floor amendment 0205 says it amends the bill by replacing all after the enacting clause, which does mean that the debate is on the death penalty. You may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was first introduced to the concept of the death penalty through the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project is a national organization dedicated to exonerating wrongly convicted individuals through DNA testing and reforming the criminal justice system to prevent future injustice. In my research, I found that African Americans make up only 13% of the nation's population, yet almost 50% of those currently on federal death row are African Americans. It seemed to me that people of color and the poor were disproportionately impacted. George Stinney, was 1944, and he was 14 years old. This young African-American youth was accused of murdering two young girls. There was no physical evidence against him, but 3 officers testified that he admitted to the killings. In one day, he was sentenced to death. 81 days later, he was executed. Today, his family members are working to prove his innocence and have him posthumously exonerated. I also read that there have been 312 exonerated people through the DNA, and 70% of those exonerated were people of color. Arnie Alpert, with the American Friends Service, wrote an article titled "Martin Luther King's First Fight Was Against the Death Penalty." He describes the story of the 16-year-old Jeremiah Reeves, who under duress confessed to raping a white woman. He later recanted but was found guilty by an all-white jury and put to death, and that was in 1958. According to Stuart Banner, who authored The Death Penalty, An American History, in the first half of the 20th century, the southern states punished many crimes by death only if they were committed by blacks. In the second half of the century, they accomplished the same result by delegating an all-white jury the discretion to choose whether it be a capital or non-capital punishment. In January of this year, I attended a Martin Luther King ceremony at Alpine Grove in Nashua. It was such an honor to meet a man named Ernest Sheju Graham. Mr. Graham was incarcerated in California at the age of 18. In 1973, while serving time in Dual Vocational Institute in Stockton, California, Mr. Graham was charged with killing a prison guard. He was sent to San Quentin's death row in 1976 and spent over 11 years in prison. He endured multiple trials, including trials by juries that excluded all African American jurors. Finally, in 1979, the California Supreme Court overturned the death conviction. It turned out that another prison guard was the real killer. The 3 cases that I have shared with you each involved African American men who at a young age were convicted of crimes of rape and murder, yet not necessarily guilty, but also sentenced to death. As I tried to understand why there were such disparities, I sought the knowledge of Sister Helen Regine, the author of Dead Man Walking. We met her here in Concord not too long ago. I asked her why there was such racial disparity in justice, and in her folksy way, she recanted her early career working with defense lawyers in Atlanta who took cases that no one else wanted. She said people who were poor had lawyers who did nothing for them. Black people were bumped from juries. They had 6 ways to Sunday to get black people off juries. When white people were killed, the death penalty was sought. When black people were killed, you were lucky if you could find 3 lines in the newspaper. White people who had killed people of color also got lesser penalties. I was struck by her analysis as she explained, it's not that people are bad or evil, it's about identification. When people like us are killed, we can relate to that. In the criminal justice system, 95% of judges are white, and the system is also white. She also noted this, the American people are not bent on the death penalty. It is not something that we give much thought about. We're busy leading our lives. But as Thurgood Marshall says, when people are educated on the death penalty, they often reject the death penalty. So my fellow representatives, each session we begin our day by pledging our allegiance to the country, and we further pledge with liberty and justice for all. I hope that after you have heard the testimony today and the many reasons why to abolish the death penalty, you will cast a historic vote to repeal the death penalty in New Hampshire and vote against this amendment. Thank you.
Will the member yield to a question?
I will
not yield. The question before the House is floor amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. The chair recognizes the member from Londonderry, Representative Baldasaro, to speak in support of the floor amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, representatives, for listening. Something as important as this here, in many years they've got up here to speak, I would think you would give representatives the respect and to answer their questions on something so important like this here that you're going to repeal. But everyone that got up here denied us the right to ask a question, so here I am. I've heard so much statistics here this evening, and I sat in the back and I laughed. I had no interest in speaking on this, but I have no choice. Because what popped in my head, since we're using statistics throughout the country, we moved from New Hampshire to other areas, because especially when we just listened to my fellow representative just bring up about race. I don't see an issue here in New Hampshire of race. I see Americans here in New Hampshire. I see everyone treated equal. But I can tell you, something's wrong here. Many elected officials throughout the country should travel around the country talking about other problems in other states. Almost 15 million children were killed. Babies. And here we are, nobody fought for these little kids. But here we are here, we're fighting over, or we're going to protect murderers. But yet we kill little babies. I don't understand it. Where I'm confused at is murder is murder. This is something here in the state where we should be thinking twice to protect our children. But yet we're sitting here listening to statistics, what went on in other states. The DNA testing has made a difference, has corrected some of the flaws throughout the history of our country. Many people have been released. It's working, the system. But yet we're going to take away on a vote the deterrent that New Hampshire has, which we've been very successful here on murder. I don't even think we fought this long, particularly on abortion, on killing babies. I'm not sure, but yet we're going to protect murderers. But I have some concern here because, and I have a brother, and I have some family that are criminals. And I'm not proud of that. But the bottom line is murder. Why are we sitting here debating protecting murder? I don't understand it.
Will the member yield to a question? The member yields. Representative Copeland, you may inquire.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for taking the question. My question with regards to the amendment is what do we do with the inmates that while they're serving a life sentence for murder, commit another heinous act of murder, either on another inmate, a correction officer, or a civilian person that works for the correctional institution?
That's a good question. We could be like, if I just heard recently, California, that let out within the last few years, what about recidivization, they call that famous word? What about 1,200 murderers? They let them out there. I was just told that by another step right, so don't quote me whether it's true or not, but he brought up something. I wish I had an answer for you. I don't know. I think they'll sit around the prison yard and sing Kumbaya or something. I don't know.
Will the member yield to another question? The member yields. Representative Dumaine, you may inquire.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative, for taking my question. I have a concern in regards to the victims' families. We repealed the death penalty today, and a person who has killed a 12-year-old child, what is to deter the parent from trying to take the life of the person who took their daughter's life?
I thank God my children, my youngest is 22, because God helped the guy that attempted anything on my child. That's all I can say.
Will the member yield to another question? The member yields. Representative O'Flaherty, you may inquire.
you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative, for taking my question. You mentioned that murder is murder. Is it still murder when the state hires an executioner to kill a man who's been rendered harmless, he's been captured and caged, and has no possibility of parole? Is that still murder?
That's a good question. But I want to say, I want to believe in the DNA testing that we have today. I mean, I ask myself a question. Is it murder when we support abortion bills and allow babies to be killed? I don't know. That's a good question.
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. I'm going to repeat because I had another person come up and ask. If you notice, this floor amendment keeps the death penalty and expands the death penalty, which is why this conversation is allowable as to this amendment. The chair recognizes the member from Amherst, Representative Rowe, to speak in opposition to the floor amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will very briefly like to talk to you about an experience, personal experience I had over 50 years ago. It was in the first semester of law school, where we had in criminal law a series of classes on murder. Now, all murder is not capital murder. There's not a death penalty for other than capital murder. But in this case, in the criminal law class, end of one of the series, the professor assigned a case, just one case, to the class. And that was unusual, because he usually gave 12 or more cases to be studied for the next session. We read the case in my study group, and we wondered why. It was a very simple, straightforward case. It didn't really have much merit. The facts were that a group of people saw a man walk across a field to the river. He was carrying a sack. The sack squiggled. He would put it down and kick and beat that sack. But the people thought, well, it's puppy ammo, none of our business. They didn't do anything. A few days later, the sack washed out on the shore, and there was an infant female in the sack, dead. Well, we attended the next session, and the professor, as he usually did, picked on one person to really work over for that class. And he had a dialogue with that person. And we noticed while he was speaking with that student that he was becoming hoarse, fidgety. Eventually, he was unable to speak. He was choked up. And he waved his hands in the air and rushed out of the classroom. Well, this entire class was stunned. They didn't know what to make of it. But eventually, one by one, they left. What we found out was that professor had been the prosecutor. He aggressively prosecuted the killing of that young child. He insisted on the death penalty, and he received the death penalty. Unfortunately, a few days after the execution, they found the real killer. That professor, every semester, assigned that case to punish himself for killing an innocent person. What did I learn from that class? The lesson is very simple. That courts, legislatures, judges, police are human. We make mistakes. And if, in fact, we
final speaker, so I would ask the Sergeant at Arms to encourage those out in the antechamber to quietly take their seats. The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. The Chair recognizes the member from Hampton, Representative Cushing, to speak in opposition to the floor amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, members of the committee. I rise to speak in opposition to the floor amendment and in support of the bill to repeal the death penalty. At the outset, I want to acknowledge that this is a really difficult conversation. It's as difficult as any of the ones that we will have in this chamber. And I know that people on both sides of the issue approach this with sincerity, with goodwill, with morals, with appreciation for just how difficult it is. Because at the end of the day, the reason that we're having a conversation here in Reps Hall in 2014 is because people are murdered. We don't have the death penalty for apostasy, we don't have the death penalty for assault, we have it because people are murdered. And at the end of the day, there's nothing that we're going to do today that will restore, that will change the past, that will restore to life people who have been murdered. Now, I first spoke on this issue, this well, 16 years ago, in support of repeal the death penalty with my friend Clifton Beale. We sponsored a measure to abolish capital punishment. And I came to that position because a decade earlier, my father was shotgunned to death in front of my mother in our family home, in the home where I live today. And so for me and my family, thinking about what you do in the aftermath of murder isn't really an intellectual exercise. It's part of our lives. It's part of who we are. And I approach this conversation from a victim-survivor lens. And I just tell you that murder is not very good. Since the last time I spoke here in opposition to the death penalty, though, on March 28th, 2011, my brother-in-law, Stephen, was murdered. And I thought my family had already used up our quota of family members being killed. But there was still, but that wasn't the case. And so I stand before you as a survivor of a homicide that took place a long while ago, and also as a homicide that's really incredibly fresh, incredibly painful. There's nothing that prepares you for having a family member murdered. And most of what my immediate reaction, and the reaction of all survivors, involved what do you do about the empty chair at the kitchen table? What do you do with kind of the keening that takes place in your heart? And after my dad was murdered, I didn't really even think that much about, I didn't think at all really about the death penalty until an old family friend came up to me in the corner grocery store after my father's killers were murdered and said, hey Rennie, I hope they fry those expletive deleted. I hope they fry the expletive deleted so you and your mother and your family can get some peace. Well, I didn't really know how to respond because this is a guy who, in wishing that there'd be an execution for my father's killer, thought he was giving me some kind of he meant this out of it was an act of generosity, I think. He thought it would make me feel better. But the reason I couldn't respond to it is because I didn't know what to say. Because this man had also known me my whole life, and he knew that before my father was murdered, I opposed the death penalty. Not because that I gave it that much thought, but when I was an adolescent, I just adopted a series of values, I think, that I wanted to live my life by, and that included not wanting to see people put to death. But I realized, as this old friend's talking to me, that he presumed that because my father had been killed, I would change my position on capital punishment. And I thought about that. And I thought that, you know, if he did that, if that happened, if I changed my position on the death penalty because my father was murdered, well, that would only give over more power to the murderers. That would only give over more power to the killers. Because not only would my father be taken away from me, it's so do with my values. And I think it's the same for society as it is for individuals. If we let those who kill turn us into killers, the evil triumphs, violence triumphs, and things just get worse. So for me, part of this is wanting to not make things worse, and also bearing witness. I know that, you know, my friend who is offering me comfort by having an execution solution to the victim's pain, I come to realize that there's this paradigm in our society that we heard referenced. It's the assumption that all family members of murder victims want to see the person who killed their loved one put to death. That they need this ritual killing by public employees as a way that could lead to healing, as a kind of a balm for victims' pain. And if, you know, somehow that if you don't want that as a victim, you must be either a psycho or a saint. The reality is those of us who've had this painful experience and the most awful thing happening, muddle through it and just kind of come to conclude that the death penalty doesn't do the one thing that we really want, and that's bring our loved ones back. Nothing can do that. But the death penalty also sometimes creates, one thing that bugs me is that it creates a hierarchy of victims based upon, you know, our current law, based upon the category of who's been killed. And I want to say one thing as we hear a litany of murders. And yes, there are people who do gruesome things, awful murders. But for a family member of murder victim, the most heinous murder, the worst murder, is that of your own loved one. And, you know, in the state of New Hampshire, where we single out, you know, one or two murders out of hundreds, of thousands, really, for one special penalty, in a way, for the family members of murder victims for whom the state does not focus a lot of attention upon the killer, upon their killer, it raises a question about fairness of victims. You know, until last July 1st, we spent 0 general fund dollars trying to solve the 120 unsolved homicide cases in the state of New Hampshire. And this, at the same time, when routinely people are going before, the Attorney General's office is going before the fiscal committee and asking for hundreds of thousands of dollars to be allocated to pursue one particular case. The reality is that we want to solve all homicides, and we want to prevent all homicides. I was struck in the hearing that we had on this bill by the testimony of former Attorney General Philip McLaughlin and former Attorney General Greg Smith. Because these are people who understood the death penalty. They had to deal with it up front and up close. And I thought about what it was like for them to have to evolve on this question and to stand up and to say that in the past they both had supported the death penalty. They both had changed their position on it. And how difficult that can be sometimes to evolve and to do so on a complicated issue. I was really struck by some of my peers in here who have evolved on the issue, who have changed over time, and I'm touched and I'm inspired. And I'm always inspired and moved by the family members, like we saw here before the committee, who testified and said to us that, please, don't have the death penalty in our name. I would ask you to please vote down this pending amendment and then go on to vote to pass House Bill 1170. New Hampshire to live without the death penalty, and the time to repeal it is now.
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. Representative Cebrowski requests a roll call. Is that sufficiently seconded? It is sufficiently seconded. This will be a roll call vote. Will members please take their seats? Chair recognizes Representative Sapareto for a parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, if you believe that monsters who kill young children should never be allowed to kill again, more importantly, Madam Speaker, if you believe that we, all of us in this room, are to blame when a killer who's allowed to live, who tells us that he's going to kill again, does so. Because it's impossible to keep them away from all people during their entire lifetime. Okay, would I now press the green button to pass this amendment?
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. This is a roll call vote. If you're in favor, you'll press the green button. If you're opposed, you'll press the red button. The Chair recognizes Representative Cushing for a parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, if I know that rather than expanding the death penalty, we should be abolishing it, would I now press the red button to defeat this motion and go on to repeal capital punishment?
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. This is a roll call vote. If you're in favor, you'll press the green button. If you're opposed, you'll press the red button. Voting stations are open for 30 seconds. Have all members voted who were here when the question was put? The House will be attentive to the state of the vote. 83 having voted in the affirmative, 247 in the negative. The floor amendment fails. The question before the House is ought to pass on House Bill 1170. It's still on second reading. The Chair recognizes the member from Manchester, Representative Vaillancourt, to offer a floor amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I offer Floor Amendment 2014-0916H, which is printed on the supplemental calendar 14A.
Representative Vaillancourt moves Floor Amendment 0916H and is recognized to speak to his motion.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
people. And we want to do certain things to make our society better. We want to feed all the people. We want to make sure everybody has food to eat and no one goes hungry. We all pledge ourselves to doing that. And then we walk in a room with food and we see lots of people in that room who are obviously very healthy. They've been fed very well. And we start distributing the food to them, but they don't need the food. And then we see a couple of emaciated people over in the corner somewhere, and we say, no, this food isn't for you. What does that make us? Imagine, if you will, Madam Speaker, that we're all good people, and we want to have shelter for everyone. And we build shelters, and we build enough shelters so that most people can be housed. And we find that most people are already housed, and they don't need the shelters we created. And then we find some people under the bridge, and we say, oh, no, the shelters are not for you. What kind of people are we when we do that? We're hypocrites. If you pass this death penalty repeal bill without this amendment, you would be doing what I just alluded to in those two examples. You would be pledging to feed all the people and then denying food to the people who really need it. You would be saying you're going to give shelter to all the people and then denying shelter to those that really need it. The final speaker on the last bill said New Hampshire can live without the death penalty. But we can only live without the death penalty if this amendment passes. The previous speaker said we need to abolish the death penalty. But let's not kid ourselves. We are not abolishing the death penalty unless this amendment passes. There is an elephant in this room, a very large elephant. You all know, as well as I do, what that elephant is. It is the only man who will die regardless of whether this bill passes or not, unless this amendment passes. So how can you look yourselves in the mirror, the huge majority of you that just voted against the previous amendment, the 247 of you, and say, oh yes, I really want to abolish the death penalty. You don't want to abolish the death penalty. You just want to score a cheap political victory. You just want to notch another state. New Hampshire joins the others who've abolished the death penalty, when you've in fact abolished nothing, because my Gladstone will still die. And if you really believe in abolishing the death penalty, and I respect my friend from Bedford, who talked about evil people. I respect him probably more than I do people who say they want to abolish the death penalty and still want to kill Michael Addison. Because you can't have it both ways. You can't be anti-death penalty and for killing one person. Because death is really the kind of thing either you go all in or you don't go in it at all. Because my friend from Bedford was correct. There are evil people in this world. There are such evil people that we would want to grab them individually by the throats and kill them ourselves if we could. But we are not here representing ourselves. When we come here, we put our individuality aside and we represent what's in the best interest of society. Society must be worth more than the sum of its individual parts. That is the only reason to abolish the death penalty. If we believe that society must be worth more than its individual parts. When I talk about the death penalty, I'm usually, and I don't believe in ghosts, so I'm going to use the word loosely, I'm usually haunted. And I mean haunted in the sense that I get this feeling, kind of like when I was in Berlin, Germany after the wall came down, and there was this palpable feeling of something happening in the air, something you will never forget. When I talk about the death penalty, I get this
haunting feeling 4 or 5 times. In a little while, I'm going to talk to you about the haunting I get from Michael Addison, and an experience that happened to me in the Elliott Hospital a few years ago. I wasn't a patient. I was visiting my friend, Stretch Kennedy, who you all know died recently. When there was a memorial here at this microphone to honor him, I didn't participate because I love Stretch so dearly I don't think I could have gotten through it. But I was in the hospital visiting Stretch Kennedy about the time of Christmas several years back when I was haunted, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But I've always been haunted by the death penalty. I remember driving back from a weekend in Montreal. In the middle of the night, as I was driving back, it got to be morning, and Timothy McVeigh was killed, and I felt terrible. He was an awful human being. But if you believe that society doesn't have the right to kill one person, then you've got to believe that we must not kill anybody, including awful people like Timothy McVeigh, including awful people like Michael Addison. The only way we can preserve society's purity, if you believe that we don't have the right to kill people, is by passing this amendment, which simply says that any person sentenced to death pursuant to RSA 630:1 for an offense committed prior to this effective date of this act shall, in lieu of death, serve a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Now somebody has questioned the legality of us passing this. I'm glad they gave me time because before lunch I went to our House Legal Counsel and he cited the case State versus Doe, 1974, which clearly makes this amendment constitutional, and I'll read the line that makes it constitutional. While it withholds the power to make retrospective laws for punishment of offenses, it leaves to the legislature the power to make such laws at its discretion for the mitigation of punishment. So we have every right to pass this amendment and then to pass the bill as amended. And I say to you, we have every obligation to do it if, in fact, we don't believe in the death penalty. One of those hauntings that happened to me, and the Reverend spoke from Bedford, alluded to this, was in fact Carlos de Luna. I had just visited the place I grew up in Vermont, Shoreham, Vermont. I grew up in the 1950s. And I decided to walk around the streets of Shoreham to see my childhood haunts, where I used to spend time as a child. The elderly lady that used to play Chinese checkers with me, well, she was obviously no longer there. The little kids I grew up with were no longer there. My grandparents, my father's mother and father, ran a hotel which happened to be just across the street from where I lived when I was a little boy. So I parked my car next to the hotel, which is now run by a yuppie couple catering to bicyclists traveling through Vermont. I went to the monument on the common of Shoreham and touched the name of my father, who was a World War II veteran. I don't know where he served. I don't know much about my father because somebody alluded to it. It's correct. My father was murdered. And I don't harbor any ill will to the person who murdered it. In fact, strangely, and this is where the haunting occurs, I grew up as a child being told by a lot of people around me that my father deserved to die because he did something he shouldn't have done. And he suffered the consequences, not at the hands of society, but at the hands of a black man in Washington, D.C. I never knew when he died until this summer, when as I was walking around the streets of Shoreham, Vermont, one of the houses where I used to have a lot of friends and used to play when I was a kid, there was this old man standing out in front. And I thought, God, that might be Frenchie, who was the owner back in the 1950s. So I'm not usually an extrovert, but I walked up to him and I started, really, I don't usually walk up to strangers and start talking. But I walked up to Frenchie And I said, I wonder if you could be somebody I knew back in the 1950s. And he admitted that he was. And of course, one thing led to the other, and he admitted that he knew my father. And he told me something that I never knew before, that not only was my father murdered, but he was murdered on Christmas Eve, 1954, coming up on the 60th anniversary. I never was all that curious before, but then I called my aunt, and she said, this is no relation to my father, it's from my mother's side of the family. She said, oh yes, she never told me this before, I guess she felt guilty for never telling me. Your father was killed in Washington, D.C. He had gone to Christmas Eve Mass. He was a good Catholic, you can tell with the name that I come from a Catholic family. And after he had gone to the Mass, he went out to drink and had too much to drink and started calling names to people, and he was stabbed to death. End of story. But it was still fresh in my mind when I got to Montreal and was having a weekend trying to live down what I had learned about my father, and happened to be listening to ABC radio when on came the story of Carlos de Luna. It was an ABC weekend report, and the member from Bedford is correct. I played it to the Criminal Justice Committee, and I hope to play it to the Senate if, in fact, this bill gets as far as to the Senate. And I'm really stunned, because the kind of evidence you heard, it was a warm night, it was a really, really warm night, but as I sat there listening to this 10-minute report, I was chilled. You heard the member from Bedford imply that he was found guilty because he had a certain amount of money in his pocket. Can you believe finding somebody guilty for that? Let me just read you a little passage from this chilling experience of Carlos de Luna and suggest to you that we'll have a chilling experience if we had killed Michael Addison as well. Texas convicted and executed de Luna all right, despite the fact that there was no blood or DNA linking him to the scene of the crime. The state executed him despite the fact that the only eyewitness to the crime identified de Luna while the suspect was sitting in the back of a police car parked in a dimly lit lot in front of the crime scene. In fact, when ABC News for this report went back and talked to the witness, he said he was only 50% sure that he had identified the right man. Killing somebody based on 50% sure? No civilized society would accept that as good enough. Texas executed him despite the lack of de Luna's fingerprints at the crime scene, the lack of victims' hairs and fibers on his body. From a bloody scene, there was nothing. Texas convicted and executed de Luna despite the fact that the police and prosecutors knew, or should have known, that the real murderer was a man named Carlos Hernandez. We killed an innocent man when we killed Carlos de Luna in Texas. And I'm haunted by that fact. I'm haunted by a lot of things when I think of death penalty. I don't want to add one more haunting to what I have to live through. I don't want to add the death of Michael Addison to that. And that's why I've added this amendment to this bill. And now we get to the Elliott Hospital in Manchester. My friend Stretch Kennedy, who coincidentally sat next to me, right where the sponsor of this bill is sitting now in the back of the hall, was very ill. He was in the Elliott, and I went to visit him, as I said, to lead up to Thanksgiving. And you know when you're ill, you sometimes stay in and out of consciousness, or you nod off a little bit. Well, Stretch was doing that at the time. And I was sitting there talking to another gentleman. You know, to get the full thrust of this, you have to remember when we did the eulogy for Stretch, that Stretch was involved in law enforcement, deputy sheriff up in Maine, and a lot of police officer friends. As Stretch nodded off, a gentleman whose name will remain nameless today sat there talking to me, a gentleman from law enforcement who told me things about the Addison case. Things that might not have proven the innocence of Michael Addison, but would certainly have led any rational human being to think twice about the premeditated nature of the crime. I asked this gentleman what well, shouldn't you go to the Addison defense team and let them know this while they plan the repeals? I don't know if you ever went there, but I knew that if I ever had the chance, I would talk about this, because while the white murderer of a police officer, Officer Sharon, did it in the worst cold-blooded fashion you could imagine and didn't get the death penalty, this black man, Michael Addison, and I believe police did things not maybe to cover it up, but to change the way the story came out. According to a police officer who was sitting in the Elliott Hospital, as Stretch nodded off, I learned this. I'm haunted by that. I hope not to have to be haunted by the death of Michael Addison when I know these things. Michael Addison did a terrible thing, but what he did was no worse than what I think his name was Perry did to Officer Sharon. That's the problem with the death penalty. How do we do it on a fair manner? How do we say you're going to die and somebody else is not going to die? Is it all right to kill my father? He wasn't a police officer. He did fight for his country in World War II. Is his life worth any less than a police officer or somebody else? I don't think so. And that's the problem you have when you deal with the death penalty. You never know who's going to get it, why they're going to get it. And I would just like to try to answer one of the questions that came up previously. I think it was the representative from Londonderry who said if anybody harmed one of his family members, he would go after that person individually. I suggest that you might think that's true, but I would also suggest you probably wouldn't do it. We all know that O.J. Simpson slaughtered Ron Goldman, and I think we all know that Ron Goldman's father and sister never went after O.J. Simpson. Our desire for revenge is never quite as great as we think it is. It is usually satiated before we get to the act of doing it. And if we are that way as individuals, then we should certainly be that way as a society. If we pass the death penalty repeal without adding this amendment, which would spare the one life of the one person that really needs sparing, it would be like spreading food around to people that have plenty of it and not giving any to those who really need it. Or like providing housing to those who have housing, but not to those people under the bridge. It defeats the whole purpose if we are to do this bill without this amendment, which is perfectly constitutional. I guess I started thinking this way when I read an editorial in Foster's Daily Democrat. It says February 14th, so I assume it's February 14th. And I think they got it right. They support the death penalty, but they got it right. They said the only objection we believe which still stands is on moral grounds. It is the objection to state-sanctioned murder, as opponents argue. And we fault no one if they hold that belief. I hold that belief. I don't believe in state-sanctioned murder. I don't believe it for somebody that might kill somebody 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and I don't believe it for somebody that happened to kill somebody 5 or 6 years ago. Look at it this way. This House passed the repeal of the death penalty in 2000. It passed the Senate. Had it been signed into law by Governor Shaheen, rather than vetoed then, we wouldn't be in the dilemma we're in today. We wouldn't have to be here deciding whether we should pass this amendment or not, because the death penalty would have already been repealed. It's a difficult issue. I agree that it's a difficult issue, but I will never take the coward's way out. I will never claim a victory, and as you can see from the first vote, anti-death penalty people are going to score a major victory today. But at what cost do we score a major victory? We sell our souls unless we vote for this amendment. I thank you, Madam Speaker. I will take questions, by the way.
The member yields to a question. Representative Burt, you may inquire.
Madam Speaker, thank you, fine representative, for taking my question. There is no doubt in my mind, and I believe there's no doubt in anybody's mind in New Hampshire, that Michael Addison is as guilty comes. He is more than guilty for killing that poor policeman the way he did it. I feel, and this is where the question's going to come in, I feel he should be put in a bathtub and throw a damn toaster in on top of him. Now, I apologize if some people disagree with me on that, but where the question is, this guilty man that you're trying to get off, according to the Constitution, you cannot, sir, pass a law for one man, and that is what this is doing. Is that correct?
No, it is not correct. If you will read the amendment, I guess I can read it to you again. It actually does deal with only one man, but it's not worded that way. Any person sentenced to death pursuant to RSA 630 for an offense committed prior to the effective date of this act shall, in lieu of death, serve a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Nowhere does it mention any one man. And where your anger is very legitimate, and I share it concerning Michael Addison, where is a similar anger for Mr. Perry, who slaughtered in cold blood Officer Sheriff? That's the problem with the death penalty.
Will the member yield to a follow-up?
No follow-ups. Somebody else wants another question. I mean, we're not going to get into a running debate here, but I will take a legitimate question if someone else has one.
Representative Sapareto, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Representative, for taking my question. The question to you is, Michael Addison said he's going to kill again. I had cut out a stack of articles of people who have been convicted for life who killed again, killed guards, or killed other inmates. Now, here's someone who said he's going to kill again. So my question to you, Representative, is that when he does kill again, which it's impossible to keep him from other people for the remainder of his lifetime, he does kill again, why aren't we responsible?
Has Mr. Perry killed again? How many people who are in prison for life kill again? You can say anything in the heat of passion, but I don't think he'd kill again. I think we can do something to prevent him from killing again, and I think we can make his life living hell without killing him.
Will the member yield to another question? Member yields, Representative Cali-Pitts, you may inquire.
Thank you for taking my question. My question would be is if this amendment doesn't pass, can we still go to the governor, or does the governor still have the ability to make that sentence life without parole rather than death?
Well, the governor has the power to do certain things. I wouldn't hold my breath expecting it. I believe she's already weighed in on the other side of that. So I would think she would have the power to commute any sentence, have the power to set him free completely. But I wouldn't recommend doing that. And this makes it quite clear that the option would be life without parole, which if you look at opinion polls, I'm not going to lie to you, Americans still favor the death penalty, but overall it's about 50-50 if they're given the option of life without parole, which is what this amendment does.
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0916 on House Bill 1170. The chair recognizes the... will the member yield to another question? The member yields. Representative Heffron, you may inquire.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, if your amendment passes, do you think that this bill will become law this year?
I think that question would be out of order.
The member is correct.
I withdraw the question.
And you know why it's out of order? Because that would presume that the other house or the governor would do something that we're not allowed to presume in this body.
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0916 on House Bill 1170. The chair recognizes the final speaker, the member from Nashua, Representative Harriott-Gathright, to speak in opposition to the floor amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This has been a long day and long testimony, so I'm going to try to make this as short as possible and quite properly. Madam Speaker and honorable colleagues, I rise to oppose this amendment so that this body can move to vote for the bill as written. The bill that was voted out of committee with a strong bipartisan majority. As a member of the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee, we heard compelling testimony that the death penalty does not protect public safety, that it squanders precious public resources, that it requires flawed human beings to make no errors at every step of a lengthy and complex legal process, and that it violates our society's deeply held values for life. We heard that the death penalty requires us to distinguish between different classes of victims in a morally dubious quest to objectively decide which murders are the most heinous. We heard that cold cases lack proper funding, and we heard that it adds to the pain experienced by the murdered victim family members. As the sister-in-law of a murder victim, one whose case has never been solved, I agree with that sentiment and join with the majority of the committee in support for the ought-to-pass motion for the bill as written, which means I do not support the amendment. Madam Speaker, the 10 initial co-sponsors of HB 1170 signed on knowing this bill would not overturn sentences already determined, and with the knowledge that recent repeal bills passed in Connecticut and Maryland also used this approach. The additional 100-plus representatives who signed on as co-sponsors under Rule 36D did so knowing the bill is prospective. At the public hearing held in the chamber on January 16th, no one proposed amending the bill to make it retrospective. At the executive session held February 11th, no one proposed an amendment to make the bill retrospective, including our colleague from Manchester. Madam Speaker, the bill as written has an excellent chance of approval. Adoption of the bill as written is the most direct route we currently have, and I say that again, is the most direct route that we currently have to repeal the New Hampshire death penalty and ending executions in the granted state. Colleagues, I ask you to please press the red button and vote no on the amendment so we can take up the original bill as passed by the Criminal Justice Committee. Thank you for your time and patience.
The question before the House is for Amendment 0205 on House Bill 1170. Who requests? Representative Baldasaro requests a roll call. Is that sufficiently seconded? It is sufficiently seconded. This will be a roll call vote. Will members please take their seats? Question before the House is for Amendment 0916 on House Bill 1170. This is a roll call vote. If you're in favor, you'll press the green button. If you're opposed, you'll press the red button. Chair recognizes Representative Vaillancourt for a parliamentary inquiry.
Madam Speaker, no matter what kind of badge I might wear, saying New Hampshire can live without the death penalty, if I realize that unless this amendment passes, we will not be living without the death penalty, then I now press the green button.
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0916 on House Bill 1170. This is a roll call vote. If you're in favor, you'll press the green button. If you're opposed, you'll press the red button. The Chair recognizes Representative Cushing for a parliamentary inquiry.
Madam Speaker, if I know that the most effective way we have to end the death penalty would be passed the bill as recommended by the 14-3 vote of the Criminal Justice Committee, would I now press the red button, defeat this amendment, and go on to pass the bill as recommended by the committee?
The question before the House is Floor Amendment 0916 on House Bill 1170. This is a roll call vote. If you're in favor, you'll press the green button. If you're opposed, you'll press the red button. Voting stations are open for 30 seconds. Have all members voted who are here when the question is put? The House will be attentive to the state of the vote. 85 having voted in the affirmative, 245 in the negative. The floor amendment fails. The question before the House is ought to pass on House Bill 1170. The Chair recognizes a member from Merrimack, Representative Nodder, to speak in opposition to the committee report. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the committee report that ought to pass. When I ran for my first term, one of the issues I ran on was justice for victims of heinous crimes. It is still an issue that I believe in. Would the member please suspend? The House will be in order. It's very noisy in here. The member has a right to be heard. I would ask you to please keep that in mind. You may proceed. Thank you. That doesn't mean that I think that every murderer should get the death penalty. Only the worst of the worst. The death penalty law in New Hampshire covers limited situations of murder. Last term we had a slight expansion with the Kimberly L. Cates law that added home invasion murders to the list. It was a bill that I was proud to co-sponsor. The new law could not be applied to the thugs who murdered Kim Cates, but if there were to be another crime of a similar nature, the possibility could not be ruled out. How quickly we seem to have forgotten the Mount Vernon murder. Maybe we need to be reminded of it before we vote on this bill. Early in the morning of October 4th, 2009, Kim Cates and her daughter Jamie were brutally attacked in a home invasion. A group of heartless thugs broke into the Cates home, armed with knives and a machete. They cut the power and made their way down the long hall until they reached the master bedroom. Kim pleaded with the attackers, saying, "You don't have to do this." She weighed only 90 pounds. She punched and kicked with all her might, and she didn't have a chance against these creatures. You don't know what they did to her. I read the transcript, so I do. And that is how I know that a lifetime in jail is not justice for a crime such as this. Sleeping in mommy's bed is supposed to be the safest, most secure place in the world for a child. That is where Jamie was on the night her mother was murdered. She was only 11 years old. The extent of Jamie's injuries were horrendous. I don't know how to relay the brutality of it all. I'm purposely not describing the injuries to you because it was that gruesome. Jamie was grievously injured, thrown across the room to the far wall, maimed, bleeding. She could hear her mom struggling to breathe.
until the killer silenced her forever. Then they kicked and stabbed the child one more time. Then they turned the lights back on to view the scene of horror that they created, laughing with pleasure at what they did. I have been to the Cates home. I saw for myself how far that child had to crawl to get to the phone. This is a very long house, okay? Jamie was at the far end of the house, near death herself. She must have had help from above to give her the strength to crawl across the master bedroom, past her mother, past the den, past the bathroom, past her own bedroom, past the living room, and then finally, somehow she made it to the kitchen. The cell phone was on the counter. I don't know how she managed to reach up to get it. She called 911 and barely got the words out. They killed my mommy, and then she passed out. You might recall that a brave police officer injured his shoulder breaking the door down to get to Jamie. He saved her life. People all over the country were shocked by this murder. I know of an 11-year-old girl in my town of Merrimack who was affected by this murder. Elizabeth met Jamie only once, but she remembers the two of them squirting water down on everyone who walked by them at the water park the previous summer. Elizabeth's mom, Nancy, came to the State House for the first time ever to testify at the Senate hearing for the Kincaid's bill. After the murder, Elizabeth slept in her mom's room for a whole year because she was too frightened to sleep in her own room, worried that her family might suffer the same fate. The doctor had to prescribe medication for her. Jamie Cates has had numerous surgeries since the attack. As I was typing this up, I started to write every March when the date popped up automatically, and I went, oh my gosh, it's March 7th. I think that was Kim's birthday. Well, I wrote this speech on March 7th, but when I checked, her birthday was actually March 6th. So it was on her birthday in 2010 when we were at the Cates home. And I heard Jamie say, today is Mommy's birthday. The sound of her voice saying those words are forever in my mind. She will never see her mommy again. And I haven't even mentioned her dad, Dave Cates, the heartbreak of losing his wife and best friend. You have no idea how hard it was for him to come here and testify for the Kincaid's bill. But he did because he too believes that a lifetime in prison is not justice for the most brutal of murders. The heartless monsters who murdered Kincaid's have the opportunity to visit their family members for as long as they live. Well, their family members can visit them. There is no ball and chain around their ankle. There is no strict diet of bread and water. No, a lifetime in prison with everything paid for by the taxpayers. They can earn college degrees, even a PhD, or more. Please remember the Cates family. And remember that this wasn't even the first home invasion murder in New Hampshire. Please remember the Dartmouth professors, Kath and Suzanne Zantoff. They were killed in home invasion murder in 2001. And finally, I noticed that some of our honorable colleagues wear a pin with a number on it. The number is 83. 83 was Officer Michael Briggs' badge number. He was shot to death in the line of duty in 2006, leaving his wife a widow and his two young children fatherless. The issue is the repeal of the death penalty in New Hampshire, not the other states, just this one. Since the year 1734, 24 people have been executed in New Hampshire. No one has been executed in New Hampshire since 1939. So you see, the death penalty is not overused. There is currently one person on death row in New Hampshire, and the repeal of this law will not affect the murderer who took Officer Briggs' life. But should there be another heinous murder in this state with no death penalty, what is there to take off the table to get the murderers to cooperate if such action is needed? The death penalty for the worst of the worst. Justice for victims of heinous crimes. Repealing this law prevents it. I ask you to join me in pushing the red button to overturn the committee report on to pass.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The question before the House is ought to pass on House Bill 1170. The Chair recognizes the member from Merrimack, Representative Peterson, to speak in opposition to the committee report.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to the ought to pass on House Bill 1170. Since 1734, there have only been 24 people executed in New Hampshire, and no one since 1939. The death penalty is not used often, but it is available for horrific crimes if necessary. Officer Briggs was killed in the line of duty, and his killer was sentenced to death. Victims of heinous crimes deserve justice. Keeping the death penalty on the table, it is always available if needed, such as in the case of Kim Case. I'm keeping it short at that. She hit it on the points. Thank you, and I ask that you vote against the ought to pass on House Bill 1170. Thank you.
The question before the House is ought to pass on House Bill 1170. The Chair recognizes the final speaker, the member from Nashua, Representative Mangiputi, to speak in support of the committee report.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, Honorable colleagues. As the newest member of the Committee on Criminal Justice and Public Safety, I came on to this discussion about the repeal of the death penalty. I wholeheartedly support repealing this death penalty, HB 1170, with 3 reasons. One is, the first one is, having sat through the whole public hearing, the emotional aspect, I'm only looking at the emotional aspect of the whole process. The victim, family members of the victim, there were about 6 to 8 that came and spoke their heart. And what I took from their testimony is that none of them wanted the killer of their loved one executed, because that did not give them an emotional closure, as it was said in many instances that the victim's family had emotional closure. And also the second one is the public employees of the police officers, the whole process of execution. The individuals that need to go through the process, their emotional trauma, or they have to live with it, witnessing this execution. And the last one is our chair, Representative Pentelakis, very eloquently said she has been opposing this all along until this year when she made 2 statements, and when we we discussed this bill at the committee level, that there were 2 murders. The first one was the white male killing an officer that got a life imprisonment, not death row. And the second one was the Addison case where the black killed police officer got a death row. And her 2 grandchildren, one graduating from police academy and the other graduating from engineering college, she said, how could I put the value of 2 of my grandsons' life differently? And in closing, I just want to say, just looking at the emotional aspect of it, I would urge my colleagues to support this so we can join the civilized world where we are not looking for eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Thank you very much.
Will the member yield to a question? The member does not yield. The question before the House is ought to pass on House Bill 1170. Representative Cushing requests a roll call. Is that sufficiently seconded? It is sufficiently seconded. This will be a roll call vote. Will members please take their seats?
We'll see how this one goes.
This is that time.
Chair recognizes Representative Jasper for a parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, if I have listened carefully to this debate, I heard one question come up several times. What about the person who kills again while in prison? Madam Speaker, if I know that in fact we cannot guarantee the safety of our prison guards and our healthcare workers, and Madam Speaker, if I know that people do kill again while they are in prison, because we hear about it time and time again, and Madam Speaker, if I know it's a fallacy to think otherwise, Madam Speaker, I think and know that we deserve to give those people who do a job for us that few of us would want to do, at least a comfort in knowing that if they are killed, no one will be killed again in the same circumstances. Would I now vote against the ITF, the ought to pass motion by pushing the red button?
The question before the House is ought to pass on House Bill 1170. This is a roll call vote. If you're in favor, you'll press the green button. If you're opposed, you'll press the red button. The Chair recognizes Representative Cushing for a parliamentary inquiry.
Madam Speaker, if I recognize that there are members of law enforcement and murder victims' family members who support passage of House Bill 1170, and Madam Speaker, if I recognize that the death penalty is a failed public policy, that it doesn't make us safer, it does not make the victim meet the needs of victims, it diverts precious resources from other activities that would help serve us better. Madam Speaker, if I know when this bill passes, first-degree murderers will spend the rest of their life in prison without a chance of parole, and there has never been anyone convicted of first-degree murder sentenced to life without parole in New Hampshire who has ever been released. Madam Speaker, if I know that since 1834 we've been discussing this matter in Representatives Hall, and I think that now, at last, is the time for New Hampshire to move beyond the death penalty, would I press the green button and vote yes to abolish the death penalty?
The question before the House is ought to pass on House Bill 1170. This is a roll call vote. If you're in favor, you'll press the green button. If you're opposed, you'll press the red button. Voting stations are open for 30 seconds. hear when the question is put. The House will be attentive to the state of the vote. 225 having voted in the affirmative, 104 in the negative. The motion is adopted.